listeners, it's Jana. Welcome back to Grief Out Loud. This episode is the first in a 3-part series focused on stories from people in the LGBTQIA+ community. This episode and the entire series is part of an ongoing collaboration between Dougy Center and the New York Life Foundation to ensure that voices from historically and currently underrepresented communities are heard in the grief world. We are deeply grateful for New York Life Foundation's tireless support of and advocacy for children and teens who are grieving. We all have different relationships with the people in our lives, and when someone dies, those relationships don't just disappear, they transform. But what happens when the relationship was already complicated, distant, or filled with misconnections? How do we grieve not just for what we had, but for what we never got the chance to have? Today, I'm talking with Never Faull about their father, who died in 2018 from cirrhosis of the liver. Nev came out as trans 6 months after their father's death, creating parallel journeys of grief and identity. They share how they've built a closer relationship with their father after his death than they ever had during his life, and how understanding autism, diagnosed for Nev and undiagnosed for their father, has helped them make sense of their family dynamics. Through photography, personal rituals, and other ways of meaning-making, Nev has found creative and touching ways to maintain their father's presence. Their story reminds us that grief isn't just about missing what we've lost. Sometimes it's about discovering new connections we never knew were possible. Never is a queer and trans, disabled, autistic, BIPOC writer, photographer, facilitator, and grief tender based in Portland. They explore the intersections of memory, identity, and mourning in their creative work. Their current project, the Dead Dad Camera Club, started with the camera their dad left behind and has become a way to navigate grief through photos and storytelling. I loved this conversation with Nev, and I'm sure you will too. Nev, welcome to Grief Out Loud.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about your dad. Who was he?
My dad's name was Robert, Bob. He was a plumber. He worked for the Washington State Department of Transportation as their master pipe fitter. I like to tell people who are familiar with Seattle, like if you're on 90 heading into Seattle, the tunnels that you go through, the Mount Baker tunnels, the sprinkler systems inside that tunnel, that's my dad. He was a hunter and a fisher, a golfer, and he was very likely an undiagnosed autistic man. He was an alcoholic, and he died from cirrhosis of the liver.
What was your relationship with him like when he died in 2018?
Yeah. My parents divorced when I was 3, and in childhood we had a very typical custody agreement where my brother and I would spend every other weekend and every other holiday with him. In adulthood, our relationship changed a lot. We didn't see each other very often. I would see him maybe once, twice, maybe 3 times a year, usually for a holiday, and maybe like once in the summer. We weren't very close, not because we had any like intense family drama necessarily, but we just didn't have a close relationship and never really got to know one another.
Is there an example of like a weekend that you went and spent with your dad, like the kind of conversation you might have had with him?
Yeah, we didn't. Conversation wasn't really big for us. Both being autistic folks, I think developing a relationship was really hard. And both being undiagnosed was really hard. I think we both wanted to connect, but we never really knew how. Neither of us were given like tools or resources on like how to develop a relationship with your kid or your parent. We would do activities together. We'd go camping. He'd take us to the Cedar River to go swimming. So it was more like a doing things kind of relationship. If I wanted to connect with him, I remember I would ask him how something worked, because he was a very like mechanically minded sort of guy. So I would ask him, we'd like see something on TV and I would ask him like how a car works, or like how a rocket ship works, or just like anything I could think of. And it wasn't really about, I didn't really want to know the answer. I just wanted him to talk about something. And I knew those were things that he would talk about, even if it wasn't like any sort of emotional connection. It was just something to try and connect through. Yeah.
So I'm picturing younger Nev being like, tell me about how a car works, Dad, just to get Dad to talk to me.
Yeah.
What story did you tell yourself as a child about why the relationship with your dad was the way that it was?
Yeah, I had some theories in my young brain. One of them was like, maybe he doesn't connect with me because I'm his daughter and not his son, because I saw him connect more with my brother. And another theory was that I knew that he didn't want to have kids. Like, that's information that I knew. And so I thought maybe he just wasn't interested in me. He wasn't interested in like developing a relationship with me. I thought, yeah, that there was just like a general disinterest. I do know now that that's very likely not the case, and that he did want to have a relationship with me, but again, just he didn't know how. And having the story of, my parent just like isn't interested in me is really hard. And I think it led a lot to, the type of relationship that we had in my adulthood, where we only saw each other like a few times a year. And I rarely called him. He rarely called me. We didn't really talk much. A lot of disconnect on both our parts. And also just like not the fault of either one of us either.
What was it like for you when you first found out about the fact that your dad had died, and how did that grief sort of show up for you in those early days and weeks and months?
It was pretty confusing. I found out from a voicemail from his sister, and I was, still living in Portland at the time. It was a shock. And then the like following weeks, and honestly up until now, it's still sometimes hard for me to remember or like believe that he's dead, because he wasn't in my life much. He wasn't regularly, we didn't have like, Sunday evening, we always called and talked to each other. We didn't have like, every June we go camping at his favorite camping spot. Like, we had no regularity or rhythm to our relationship at all. And so having to like remember all the time that he was dead was really hard. And every once in a while, I think like someone could tell me today, like, oh, your dad's actually not dead. And I'd be like, oh, really? Okay, I guess that makes sense. I haven't heard from him in a while. Like, it's been a really slow adjustment, and it's had to be like a very conscious effort to remember that he is gone, and remember who he was, and to try to still connect with him now that he's gone. I think that I've connected with him more in his death than I ever did in his life, which is really a weird thing to think about.
Yeah, I was going to say that, that sometimes there's grieving for what we had, and who the person was in our life. And then sometimes there's grieving for what we didn't get to have with them or who they didn't get to be in our lives. And I wonder how you relate to that idea of that sort of parallel grief that can unfold.
Yeah, I often think that what I'm grieving wasn't really him. And I feel some guilt around that. I grieve, this relationship with a father that I never had and never realistically could have had because of the circumstances and of who he was and who I was. So I often think it feels like I'm grieving this like hypothetical situation. Part of my grief is like a piece of anger that shows up in the way that I feel so angry with the world and the way that they treat autistic people, that he never really got any sort of like a recognition or support or like any tools for navigating the world as an autistic person. I feel pretty much 100% sure that he developed his alcoholism because that was the only like socially acceptable coping mechanism that he came across, that helped sort of dull the world a little bit and made it more tolerable for him to be in. Yeah, it feels hard to have this like weird, ambiguous, angry at the world because of what happened to him then had an impact on me.
The lack of support and awareness for him and how that contributed to what ended his life.
Yeah.
Nev, what have you learned about yourself and your diagnosis of autism that you would want to share with your dad?
A lot of things. I myself have my own like struggle with alcoholism, addiction, which once I was able to understand what autism was, what it meant for me, how it manifested in me, gave me really like all the context I needed for like why I was turning to substance use, and relieved a lot of negative self-talk, it relieved a lot of guilt. It relieved a lot of shame. It relieved a lot of the burden of addiction because it gave me context of why I was struggling so much. And I really do think that if my dad had been given a chance to like receive that same information and that same context, that it would have impacted his life a lot. Also, the ability to like celebrate the weird ways that I am, the like special interests that I have. Yeah, I wish that he could have had the chance to share his special interests with the world and in a way that felt good to him and wasn't just me and my brother sitting in the living room, sitting through one of his like million slideshows. He was a photographer. That's one of his special interests. He had the old like carousel style like slide viewer things. I remember just sitting in the living room just being like, oh my God, this is so boring. Like, I don't want to see another photo of another tree. But like if I had known, I mean, maybe as a child, not, but yeah, just the context of like, this is what your dad really loves. And like, let's celebrate him for the thing that he loves and like indulge his special interests, the way that you also like your special interests indulge in as well.
I mean, in a way, it seemed like little kid Nev kind of instinctually knew that, just going back to that idea of like, let me ask dad how a car works, or let me think about things that he can explain the mechanisms of that. It seemed like there was some way that you could even sense that.
Yeah, I think there were often like bids of connection on both of our parts, but they often got missed just because neither one of us knew how to receive that bid or reciprocate it or like take that bid and do something with it. It always sort of like seemed to fall short in a way that neither of us, I don't think, really understood.
Another aspect of identity that you didn't get a chance to share with your dad or connect with your dad about is that you came out as trans just 6 months after his death. And what was it like to be having those parallel processes of grieving for your dad and coming into this new aspect of self?
Yeah, in the first maybe year or so of coming out as trans, I was so wrapped up in everything that was happening in my life, just really focused on my process, figuring out how to come out to people, figuring out like who I wanted to be, really. I mean, still figuring that out, but it wasn't until almost 2 years after I had come out that the grief of him not knowing me really started to show up. I still feel a lot of grief and a lot of sadness around the fact that he'll never know me as me. He'll never know Nev. He'll never know me as my like fullest, happiest, most comfortable self. He'll never know me, as who I am, the like reality of who I am. It's been hard to imagine what he would have thought about this whole process because I didn't know him very well. I knew the general like flavor of his politics, I guess, but we never had any sort of conversations around queerness or transness. I have these tiny little snippets of what I think he might have thought from little bits of evidence that he left behind and just kind of what I might think he would have thought. But it's really, really hard to not have a parent there to tell you in their own words how much they love you or support you or understand you or accept you. Everything I have is just hypothetical and hopes and wishes and dreams. Yeah.
So much speculation.
Yeah, a lot of speculation.
You mentioned that you found some evidence. Is there any examples you wanted to talk about?
Yeah. The piece of evidence that I love the most, when we were cleaning out his house, one thing that I had found was this little button pin. It was like bright pink, and it said, "Keep abortion legal." I make a lot of assumptions from that one little button that I found in a drawer somewhere or whatever. It wasn't like proudly displayed, but it existed and he had it. And I was like, well, this must mean something. Like I said, we didn't talk much, but I do remember having at least one conversation with him about bathroom bills. He was still alive during Trump's first administration, and he was very confused about bathroom bills. He like could not understand why there was such a hubbub, such a fuss about like people using the bathroom. So I make a lot of assumptions from that too. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have from him. And so it is like fairly safe to say that I think he would have generally been supportive of me, but I don't really know what that support would have looked like or felt like. Yeah, I think about it a lot though.
Speaking of some of the sort of investigative journalism you've had to do to like recreate who your dad was or who he would be now with you, the camera ended up being a big part of that for you. So I wondered if you could talk about the Dead Dad Camera Club.
Yeah. So another thing that he left behind was an old film camera. He was really into photography. It wasn't something he really shared with me in my childhood or before he died, aside from like the long slideshows. Like he never taught me how to use it or asked me if I ever wanted to learn or anything. But when we found it, I decided I wanted to keep it. and I kept it for quite a few years and didn't touch it. Some friends of mine, a couple of friends of mine, who also lost their dads, they happened to have film cameras that their dads left behind too. And we would kind of like joke on and off about how we should all get together and learn how to use it, and we'll call ourselves the Dead Dad Camera Club. That never really came to fruition. But a few years ago, I started to learn how to use it. It was right after I had top surgery, and I wanted to start like documenting my life a little bit more. For whatever reason, felt drawn to the camera. My friend Sammy taught me how to use it, like the bare minimum basics of how to use the camera. And I just started taking it around places, started taking photos, did not know what I was really doing, a lot of like trial and error. And I remember getting my very first roll of film developed, and I could like see that some of the pictures were actually okay. They were like pretty good. I was like, oh, cool. Like I can kind of see why my dad was really into this. The more I started using it, the more it felt like another way to connect with him. Seeing the world the way he did through his own like literal lens. And eventually I started posting online the photos that I was taking. I had an old Instagram called the Dead Dad Camera Club. It no longer exists. I left the internet last June, but I recently started a Substack, a little newsletter where I can share those photos now. It's called the Dead Dad Camera Club. And I get this feeling when I'm holding the camera and I'm taking a photo that when I'm taking a picture, that it's like this little portal of connection between him and I, and he can see what I'm seeing in that moment, feel what I'm feeling, like see who I'm with, how I'm doing, what I'm thinking, just like what my life is like, which wasn't something I ever really got to do before when he was alive.
Yeah, I keep picturing, no pun intended, I keep picturing you like holding the camera up to your eye and seeing the world maybe a little bit the way your dad saw the world, which seems so connected to all the work you've been doing to better understand yourself through your diagnosis of autism, your dad with his undiagnosed autism. Like, who was this guy like? You know, what was he like?
Yeah. The photos have such a particular quality that I recognize because it's his camera. And so the photos that I'm taking have a very similar quality of the photos that he was taking. So I see him a lot in those photos. And actually, I don't think it's there anymore, but the first couple of years, whenever I would get any of the photos printed, I would get a note that would come back with it saying that there's a hair in the aperture and it needs to be cleaned. I couldn't clean it. I couldn't get the hair out. Like I physically I could, but it was his hair. And so he would physically show up in these photos of this, just like this tiny little hair on the side, just like mildly photobombing like all of my shots from the grave. Yeah, I can see him in the quality of the photo as well. Just like the colors, the texture, like the richness. I very much understand why film photography was one of his special interests now, because it's kind of becoming one of mine now too.
You better understand the hours you spent listening to the click of the carousel of the
slides. Absolutely. And now I'm like, friends, can I show you all my photos? Sit through my slideshow, please.
I'm sitting with Nev that your grief over your dad seems like it's unfolded over the years since he died in 2018. And the way your grief is and the relationship you had with your dad doesn't always fit kind of like the stereotype of what we think of folks who are coming to get support for their grief. So, two-part question. What did you go to for grief support? And then what was it like to bring your unique story into those contexts?
Yeah, I mean, every grief is unique. I think with all the intersecting identities that I hold, the marginalized identities that I hold, every sort of grief resource or grief support out there, like I have to interpret it in multiple different ways to apply it to myself and my situation. Going to grief group was the very first time that I really sought out support in my grief. And I love grief group. I love all the grief groups that I've gone to. And oftentimes I am maybe one of two BIPOC people in the room. I am maybe one of two trans people in the room. I am maybe one of two queer people there in the room. That's like shifted over time. And it's hard. It feels lonely. It feels difficult. It's exhausting. But there are so many ways that I can still get a lot out of other people's grief stories and their own grief processes, even if I don't share the exact same identities as another person. And our stories are always very different, but there are ways to connect.
This might be hard to do, but is there a way to give an example of that experience you talked about, of maybe there's a resource, or maybe there's a book or a written resource or a podcast episode or a conversation in grief group that you have to translate to make it more applicable or relevant for the various identities that you hold? Is there a way to give an example of that?
So in like live conversations, when I'm in grief group, a lot of times the type of relationship that people had with their person, I'll just like use the example of another person with a dead dad. Because of my dad's identity of being an undiagnosed autistic man, the parent-child relationship is just very, very different. And so I try to glean as much as I can from another person's experience, because people often are talking about the things that they miss about their dad. They share stories of things that they used to do. And I don't have a lot of that. So it's a lot of me thinking about, again, that hypothetical relationship that I could have had. And like, that's where a lot of that grief kind of gets centered on. And then with the stories, I am sort of now, post his death, creating stories for us, not in place of the stories that we could have had, but in addition to the stories that we didn't have. I have a lot of like rituals and like meaning that I make now that he's gone, as a way to like add to his story and add to my story. And then when I'm reading things or listening to podcasts, yeah, it's just like, there are a lot of great grief books out there. I'm reading The Wild Edge of Sorrow right now. That one's really great. And it's a lot. For anyone who's reading that book and applying it to their own situation, there's just a couple of added layers that I have to put on that to make it make sense for me.
I want to go back to that idea of meaning making, because I think it's one of those terms that gets said a lot or used a lot in the grief world. And we all nod our heads and say, yeah, we know what that means. But actually, like, I'm not even really sure what that means. So could you talk a little bit about like, what does meaning making mean to you?
Yeah.
And what are some of those ways you've found to do that?
Yeah. So it's kind of like a two-part thing for me. The first part being taking the few memories and like the bits of evidence that he left behind and attaching the meaning of him to those things. For example, one of the things that I found in his house when we were cleaning it out was this old iPod. It was like an old like brick of an iPod, and it had a bunch of storage on it. I didn't really know like what music he liked, and I was really excited, like, oh, I'm going to charge this thing up. I'm going to be able to like figure out like the bands that he liked to listen to. Once I got it charged and I turned it on, the only thing that was on there was all of Fleetwood Mac. And I have no idea if like he just couldn't figure out how to get anything else onto the iPod after he got Fleetwood Mac on there, or if he just really, really loved Fleetwood Mac. I'm not really sure. But now anytime I hear Fleetwood Mac, like that's my dad. When I'm in the grocery store and it comes on, I'm like, oh, hey, Dad. And like a ritual that I have now is if I'm going somewhere for his death anniversary, which I do every year, I call it the Dead Dad Trip. When we're headed out to wherever we're going, I play Fleetwood Mac the whole time. And then there's like symbols that sort of represent him. Like I know that he had a great blue heron that lived across the river from him. And I know that because one time he sent me a photo of that great blue heron. He didn't really say much about that bird at all, but I have attached a lot of meaning to that. And a great blue heron means my dad. And so when I'm on a trip, like I went up to Bellingham, I took a train up to Bellingham last September and spotted 43 great blue herons from the train window. It was just like, my dad is with me on this trip right now. Dogwood trees are also a big one because, again, he one time sent me a photo of a dogwood tree that was blooming in his yard. Didn't say anything about it. So I don't actually know how he felt about that tree, but it's now like a symbol of him. And when they're blooming this time of year, like there he is. And I have dogwood tattooed all over my body. I have a great blue heron skull tattooed on my body. So it's a lot of like, my meaning making has to do with ways that I can create for him to still show up in my life. It's all like driven by me, but I still want him to be around. And whether it's like these delusional things that I'm doing that are like not based in reality at all, like I don't really care, but I know that I can have these symbols, they can show up in my life and I can feel his presence. And I can also make rituals out of these things. I have that dead dad trip that I go on every year, because one of the few things that I knew that he regretted was not traveling very much. And so every year on his death anniversary, I try to be somewhere else. Yeah, just finding ways to just make his presence.
You've really worked at creating a relationship with your dad.
Yeah, I feel closer to him in his death than I ever did in life, which feels weird sometimes. Again, a little delusional maybe, but it's what makes me feel good. It's what makes him, still like an active part of my life.
You mentioned Grief Group being a place that you've really gone to for that support. Are there other resources that you would want to share that you've found to be helpful? I know you mentioned Francis Weller's The Wild Edge of Sorrow book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Grief Group, of course, always. Anytime I learn that someone has lost someone, I just like can be a little annoying about how much I'm like, you should go to Grief Group. Just being around other people who maybe they don't understand exactly what you're going through, but they have a much better idea than anyone else does. Not having to like explain yourself over and over, that exhausting process, and just being witnessed by folks who they know what you're going through better than anyone else does. Yeah, grief groups. Specifically for queer folks, there is locally there's the Queer Grief Club. That's run by Jamie Thrower. There's an online queer grief spill every month, which folks can find on their website, which I think is jamiethrower.com. And that one is on Zoom. So even if you're not local in Portland, you can still attend. Beyond that, it's a lot of figuring out who your local queer artists are. Because a lot of times you'll find local queer artists and their art is very often driven by grief. So finding those people, it can be hard, but they're definitely out there.
And we don't want to forget your Dead Dad Camera Club Substack for listeners to check out too.
deaddadcameraclub.substack.com.
Well, Nev, as we come to the end of our conversation, is there anything that tomorrow morning you're going to wake up and say, gosh, I really wish I had said this in my interview? Is there anything else you want to share today?
Yeah, I think people do ask me about grief stuff pretty frequently. Grief has become a pretty big part of my identity. The thing that I always tell folks about grief is that it's not something that ever goes away. I think there's this big myth around being able to heal from grief. You can experience healing in grief, but grief is something that stays with you forever. It doesn't stay the same. It changes inevitably, as like all things change. The shape of it changes, the context of it changes, the texture of it changes, but it's something that is with you for the long haul. And I wish that people didn't get too hard on themselves about not healing fast enough, or not moving on quick enough, or not doing things productively enough, or not. Grief is, and it'll be there. It'll just be there.
Well, Nev, thank you for making space for this conversation, for sharing with me, with our listeners, about your dad and about all the intentional ways that you've continued to build a relationship with him and to care for yourself and your grief, and to be an advocate in the many communities that you are a part of. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And listeners out there, I say this each and every time, but thank you for being part of our community. For those of you who have emailed me, for those of you who have shared episodes with people that you care about, for people who have gone on to Apple Podcasts and given us a rating and review, thank you for that. If you would like to reach out to me, you can email me at griefoutloud@dougy.org. It's dougy.org. It's also our main website, and there you'll find all of our free downloadable resources, information about our local programming, including our grief groups that Nev mentioned, as well as each and every episode of Grief Out Loud. Excited as always to share that the podcast is sponsored in part by the Chester Stephan Endowment Fund, and Grief Out Loud is a production of Dougy Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time.